Today we're going to talk about chapter 12. I like to think of this chapter as Calpurnia's chapter because we learn a lot about her in this chapter. And it starts out and Scout talks about Jim being 12 and how he was difficult to live with. He was moody all the time and he just wasn't really that nice to her after the days of Mrs. DeBose's death. And so he did start to change in a few weeks, and Mrs. DeBose was still barely cold in her grave, Scout says, and she does make lots of jokes like, does he have a tapeworm and stuff like that, trying to figure out what the reason is for his moodiness. But really, Calpurnia kind of tries to explain to her that he's just growing up and he is, on his way to manhood and being a mister. And so one day, Jim just says to her, Scout, it's time that you stopped being a girl and you started acting right. And that made her burst into tears. And so she ran to Calpurnia. And it's funny because at the beginning of the book, when she was like 6, she did not like Calpurnia. She actually hated her, and Jim was her favorite person, and Atticus, of course. But now the tables have kind of turned, and she goes to Calpurnia more and spends more time with her. And Calpurnia says, don't get too upset about Mr. Jim. Don't worry about him. And then Sheila says, what? Mr. Jim? He's not a mister. He's not very old. And she goes, yeah, he's just about a mister now. And so we can call him Mr. Jim because he's becoming a young man. And anyway, she is just appalled. And Calpurnia tells her that they will find things to do and not to worry about him. But then summer came and Dill did not show up. He wrote her a letter and he basically said, I'm sorry, I'm with my new stepdad and we're having a great time. And he sent a picture and he said that he would love her forever, do not worry, and he would come get her and marry her when they were older. And so she was a little happy about that, but she did stay pretty miserable for 2 whole days and pouted because she didn't get to have her normal summer with Dill. And so if that wasn't bad enough, the state legislature called Atticus into an emergency session and he had to go away for 2 weeks. And so that meant that Jim and Scout were with Calpurnia for 2 weeks, which she doesn't complain too much about. But, she hates that when he's gone. She likes spending time with her dad. And then one morning they're looking at the paper and they realize that Atticus is in a political cartoon in the Montgomery Advertiser. And basically it shows him working diligently, writing on a slate while a frivolous looking girl yelled yoo-hoo at him. And then Jim tries to say it's a compliment. It shows that he's a hard worker, and Scout's not so sure. She thinks it's kind of negative. And so Jim's just trying to be a good older brother and reassure her. But Scout's pretty smart, so she understands that there's something wrong. So they go on and they're having a talk about what they're going to do. The Atticus left, and it's not the first time, and they'll find something to do. And the next morning, Calpurnia tells them to take a bath, and she gets them all fancied up with fancy clothes. And Jim says, it looks like we're going to Mardi Gras, Cal. Where are we going? And she said, you're going to First Purchase Church, and you're going with smiles on your faces. And so First Purchase American Church was in the quarters of the southern town limits, so outside town. They've never really noticed it before. And she goes on to say that African Americans worshiped in it on Sundays, but white men gambled in it on weekdays. And so Scout points out a lot of things that are different about the church, but mostly because African Americans in this time period were very poor, and so they didn't have a lot of things. She talks about how when they get to the church, they don't have hymn books, and they don't have nicer things. They don't have pianos and organs and instruments and stuff like she's used to. But otherwise, she explains it being warm and bittersweet smells of clean Negroes. They welcomed them as they walked in. Basically, she describes it as peppermint and lilac talcum feeling and smell as well. So she clearly likes it. She just notices that they don't have as much as their church. And the men that they saw, they stepped back and took off their hats when they came in to kind of bow to them to show their respects, which was kind of strange, Scout noticed. And so they continued to walk on up, and someone says, what are you up to, Miss Cal? And Cal says, what do you want, Lula, to this lady who seems to have an attitude. And so this lady Lula says, I want to know why you're bringing your white children to N-word church. And she uses the N-word, and so that's a little crazy. But she says, they are my company. And then Lula says, yeah, I'm sure. I reckon you're their company at the Finch household during the week. And so basically implying that she's not part of the family and that she's just the help for Atticus. And then Calpurnia kind of reaches down and she says, don't fret. She whispered to Scout, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. And Lula came back up the pathway toward them again, and Calpurnia said, stop right there, N-word. And she calls Lula an N-word. And so I think that was enough to kind of scare her away. And but first she says, you have no business bringing white children here. They got their church, and we have our own. It's our church, isn't it, Cal? And so she says, it's the same God, isn't it, Lula? And so finally, she kind of walks away and leaves them alone. But then Jim says, they don't want us here, Cal. Let's go home. And Scout agreed that they didn't want them there, or some of them didn't want them there. And she just ignores the kids, and they went to go find their seat, and they saw a bunch of people, and one of them stepped out, and it was Zebo, the garbage collector, who they're very familiar with, and they like very much and think he's very nice. And he says to them, we're mighty glad to have you here. Don't pay any attention to Lula. She's not very nice, and she's a troublemaker from way back. So happy to have you here. And then they're greeted by Reverend Sykes, and he led them to the front pew and let them sit there. And Scout talks more about like how the walls are unpainted and they have kerosene lamps, and there was no sign of piano or organ, but there are some words that say God is love and light of the world. And so that was very familiar to her, and some of the same things that they saw on Sundays at church. So when they sit down, Calpurnia gives a dime to Jim and to Scout, and she says, here, these are for the collection. And Scout and Jim say, oh no, we have our own. Dad left us some money for church. And she said, you keep it. Calpurnia told them to keep it because they were her company. And so Cal is also trying to teach the kids how to be polite and respectful and treat people, especially when they're their company. Just like she did to the young man, what's his name? Little Walter Cunningham, that came over for lunch a few chapters back. So anyway, then Scout has to get curious, and she says things like, where are the hymn books? And Cal says, we don't have any. And then she shushes them, and the Reverend gets started, and he says, brothers and sisters, we are particularly glad to have great company with us today. Mr. Jim and Mr. Jim and Miss Finch. You all know their father. And before I begin, I will read some announcements, he says. And so he wanted everyone to know that they're there. They're kind of the special guests of the day. And then he goes on to talk about Tom Robinson. He says, you all know of brother Tom Robinson and his trouble, that he has been a faithful and dedicated member of the church, First Person Church, since he was a boy. And the money that is taken up today and next Sunday, 3 Sundays, will go to Helen, his wife, to take care of her and the kids. And so that's when Jim goes, that's the Tom Robinson that Atticus is defending. And then he is shushed by Calpurnia. And so then they start singing, and Zebo leads them in the hymn. And Scout is saying, how are we going to sing if we don't have any books, hymn books? And so she finally, her patience gets the best of her. And then she learns that it's called lining, that, you know, someone sings a line and everyone repeats it. And so that's how they sing, since they don't have any books. And then Reverend Sykes goes on with his sermon, and Scout mentions that Jim and her hear this sermon every Sunday. It's basically the same as their church, lots of the same messages. And anyway, they go ahead and give their dimes, and they are given a thank you. And Reverend said, it's not enough money. He says, we're closing the doors and you've got to give more. We need to make sure that we have more money for Helen and the children because she cannot work at this time. So he says to Alec to shut the doors and nobody's going to leave until they collect $10 whole, which apparently is a lot of money at this time. And so everyone digs in their pockets and gets out more money, and slowly and painfully $10 more is $10 total is collected, and the door finally opens. And Scout says she's bursting with questions by the time the end of the sermon happens, and they're walking out the door. And Reverend Sykes says, we're happy to have you here, and this church is a great friend of your daddy's. We are so happy to have him. We respect him. And Scout says, "Why were you taking up a collection for Tom Robinson's wife?" And the Reverend says, "Didn't you hear? Helen has 3 little kids at home and she can't go to work." And then Scout goes, "Why can't she go to work?" And obviously it shows her ignorance. And anyway, Reverend kind of plays it off and he says, "To tell you the truth, Miss Jean Louise, Helen is having a hard time finding anyone to hire her these days. So, but when it's picking time, Mr. Link Diaz will hire her, I'm sure, and everything will be okay." So then Jim says, "Thank you for letting us come." And Cal says, you know, "Let's go." And then as they're walking out, Scout says, "I know Tom Robinson's in jail and he's done something awful, but why won't folks hire his wife, Helen?" And she says, "It's because of what folks say that he's done. Tom's done. Folks are anxious to hire her, and they don't really want anything to do with his family right now." And then she goes, "Well, what did he do?" And Calpurnia said, "Old Bob Ewell accused him of raping his daughter and had him arrested and put in jail." And Scout has a aha moment and the light bulb flashes and she said, "Mr. Ewell?" And her memory starts to stir. She goes, "Does this have anything to do with all of those Ewells that only come on the first day of school?" Talking about in a previous chapter, the Burris Ewell that came to school, the one that cussed out his teacher and stomped out of the classroom. And she said, "Yes, those are the ones." And then Scout goes on to remember that her dad says that they're trash and that they're not very nice. And on the way home, they start talking about how the Reverend Sykes was just like their preacher and they really liked church. And they're walking home and they learn that Cal is around Atticus's age and that she is educated and that she learned from their ancestors. And so we can go ahead and infer that, her ancestors were slaves on the Finch plantation at one point in time, and they, were freed, and now Atticus and Cal have a great relationship. They grew up together, and so Cal is really part of the family, and we learn that Zebo is her son, and it makes sense because he's educated and he can read, and the kids are all putting these things together. And then one last thing they learn about Cal, and one of the things that the curiosity gets the best of them, is when Scout says, "Calpurnia, Cal, why do you talk inward talk at church or around your folks?" And she goes, "It would be weird if I talked white person talk, and that's just how it goes." And so they're like, "Well, you're educated. You don't have to talk like that." And she goes, "Well, that's just kind of my culture." And then Scout says, "Can I come stay at your house sometime and hang out with your family?" And she goes, "Anytime." And Scout's going to ask Atticus when he gets home if she can do that. And then they're walking down the street and something catches their eye. And Jim says, look down there on our porch." And they look down, and Aunt Alexandra, which is Atticus's sister, is sitting on the rocking chair on the porch just as she had done it every day of her life.